How are you doing? Welcome to the first Into the Gray of 2020. Woo! Yeah, and we're our two other guests. Okay, while we wait for them to arrive, for all those who are new that are joining us today, ITG is a series of conversations designed to inspire, to challenge, and to reimagine what culture and theology can be like in our world today. Now, normally these sessions are held live at the Evolution, but with the current pandemic, of course, extraordinary times kind of call for innovative means. But we hope that all of you tuning in still have an awesome experience, and we can't wait to share with you what we have planned. And it's, of course, my privilege right now to introduce our guest panel this evening. Their bios on our Instagram already speaks for themselves. They are people working with millennials, with Gen Z, out there inspiring and leading change by their example. So with minimal fuss, here we have Christopher Romine, woo, Estela Lowe, and John Carlos Arce Cabrera. Haha.
Yay!
Yeah, I know, guys. We're going to be doing a lot of cheering by ourselves tonight while everybody just watches us cheer.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so let's take a little time, guys, to burn into this conversation and to give everyone tuning in some context to your lives. So let's start off with just asking everybody, how is everybody doing in your respective lives, in your spaces, in your responsibilities, locations? And I thought today, Chris, maybe we could start with you, because out of the four of us, I think we'd all agree New York right now has been the hardest hit. Shelter in place has been in place since March. So how have you been? How has Common Ground, your church, been? How has New York been?
Yeah, well, welcome everybody from New York to Singapore. I'm glad to be with y'all. And New York has been hit hard. So we are sheltering in place, much like you. The daily reports that we get of cases can be quite jarring and traumatic. The good news, the really, really good news is that the curve is going down significantly in New York right now. So hospital beds in Central Park are removed, and there's actually some extra ventilators. So there's a lot of things that are going right, but it looks like we might be stuck in our small apartments for the next month or so in quarantine. Common Ground is doing things similar probably to Singapore, which is those who can shelter in place or sheltering in place, and those who might have family elsewhere. At least for New York, there's a lot of people getting out of the city and going to other parts of the country just to have a less traumatic experience. But everyone's inside out here, and everyone's just New York is very resilient. It's known for its resilience, so it's got a lot of that right now.
But you're also saying that despite, like, New Yorkers are legendarily resilient, but you're saying it's just pragmatics right now, right? If there are no jobs, you got to move away. And you've had people in your church move out as well?
Yeah, I did a count the other day for the leadership team. We were praying. We're a new church, just started in June of last year, and we've lost already, I think, 20 people.
Wow.
So that's a big number for a church that was worshiping in its 40s in its first year. So yeah, there's a lot of people rethinking if they want to live in New York. They're rethinking their industries. I support that too. I mean, in the age of a pandemic, it's wartime thinking. We reprioritize and decide, is this really what I want to do? Is this really where I want to live? And a lot of people at Common Ground have been forced out, or are at least asking that question right now of if I lost my job, do I move somewhere else?
And I gotta say, because talking to you just the other day, right, for you guys, this crisis is really extremely up close and real and personal. I'm not saying it's not real for the rest of us, especially in Singapore, but like what you said, I mean, it really is kind of like a war zone down in New York. And I think really just talking to you this week has kept things in perspective for myself in Singapore. So Estella, I was wondering, so how well would you say Singapore is faring under our lockdown measures called circuit breaker measures, especially those people in our generation, millennials, Gen Z? How you say we're doing?
That's a big question to ask me to speak for all millennials and Gen Zs in Singapore. But my observation is that it's a mixed bag, right? That you have a whole spectrum of people who are super okay with going online and connecting digitally. There's no problem at all. And then you have all the way at the other end. Of course, this is all dependent on your social your social class, your background, the environment you're living in as well. So from what I'm seeing, maybe let me just speak for my church young adults. So my millennials and Gen Zs tend to come from a more privileged background. So we have middle to upper class, very familiar with technology. There's no problems. So at the start, actually, we were doing well, but I think that this whole season is taking its toll. I mean, it's like week 5, 6, I don't know. It's just
I don't
endless.
know either. I'm just lost.
So it's starting to take its toll even on the people who are the most emotionally resilient, I would say. Even
I
on
would agree.
myself, like I crashed this week, and that was hard, but I think also gave me a bit of perspective, and to realize that I am privileged, that I only crash at week 6, because there are people who've been struggling since week 1. I think that there is fatigue when it comes to technology and Zoom fatigue, conference call fatigue. There's social media fatigue, because everybody's just like, that's the only way to connect. And then again, you go into this existential question of who am I really? So there's all kinds of things. I think this season is really a time for us to reflect on our identities, who we are, and what we put out in this world. So it's been a tough season.
Yeah, I totally get what you mean, because I think you and I have been pretty resilient during this period, and even you and I this week are like both kind of exhausted by everything, right? Okay. I want to.
But you want to be here on this Zoom, right?
No, we don't want to
No.
be here, JC. Like, we just hate being here. We don't want to talk to anybody, right?
No, but
no,
I mean,
we're glad to be here. Yeah.
For real though, an hour before this call, I was like, I don't know if I can do this. I need to like psych myself up. I need to be like, I took a nap, a really long one. Just being real. It's not easy sometimes to like gather yourself and center yourself to be able to talk about things that hurt. And so it took a bit of time, but I'm okay now.
Yeah, I'm okay because I'm having coffee right now at 8:30 p.m. Okay, so JC, on to you, right? How are you doing? Because I guess Pasadena in California, those of you who don't know, is somewhere in between New York and Singapore as far as measures are concerned. But you've got kids. And those of you who don't know, right now over there where he is, it's 5:30, 6 a.m. in the morning. So he got up just to do this amazing talk with you guys. Yeah, so how's it going for you? How's it hanging with kids?
So Pastor Stella took 6 weeks. I was like crashing week 1. But yeah, so it's been a little hard because with the kids, they're doing school from home. So I have a 10-year-old and a 3-year-old. And I think similarly to adults and young adults and the youth, the screen time is kind of positive and negative. All his schoolwork is on his Chromebook, and it's very easy, I think, at any age to get distracted. And so between doing math and going to Wikizilla, which is like Wikipedia for Godzilla, where he likes to be at, it's only a tab away, and so then it's like, hey, have you 3 hours later, have you done your work? No, I'm still on this Wikizilla page. So I think that's been a little hard. And now, the 3-year-old even knows coronavirus and will say, I want coronavirus to be done. Can we put a rule in place to get this gone? So they're feeling it. And there's a lot of dynamics to work through as a parent, and obviously as an individual.
So I have another question for you, because for those of you who don't know, JC's living in California right now, but he's originally from Puerto Rico. And I'm just wondering, like, during this period, how has it been for you? Like, how much has Puerto Rico kind of like cycled through your thoughts, besides what's going on in California?
Yeah. So all of our families, so my wife's family and my family, are in Puerto Rico. So it's been hard to be away. It's been hard to be away during something like this, especially when you think of what could happen and then you're away from family. That's been really hard. And just, you know, they've been hit hard the last, few years. The hurricane in 2017, in January, earthquakes started pretty consistently. And so it really feels like they just, we can't catch a break.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of, I think, ongoing trauma because of all those events.
Yeah.
And so people, I think, are trying to cope and move forward, but it's not easy, especially when you have a incompetent government. So
Yeah. Yeah. So again, for those of you who are joining us and you may not know the background, Puerto Rico had a hurricane. How long has it been now?
2017. Yeah,
2017,
September
and it was a
2017.
really tough recovery. I'm not sure it's even recovered right now. And then now there's coronavirus, and yeah, it's just really can't catch a break. Yeah, and so has it been different? What's drawn your attention over here in California, and what's drawn your attention in Puerto Rico?
I mean, I can't say that. So California, I think there's a distinction between states and the national level here in the U.S. And Pastor Chris can talk about that as well, in terms of like New York government and the governor there and our president in this country. So I think California has done pretty well. Our governor and the mayors here locally have done a pretty good job of communicating well and letting citizens know what to do, what's going on. I think in Puerto Rico, they were, before any of the states, they did a lockdown. But there's a difference between just doing a lockdown and actually having a plan and following through on that plan. So there they just locked down and gave contracts to friends and just a lot of corruption. And so I think the difference that I've seen is probably, I would say, in government leadership and like really letting the citizens know what to expect and what's next. And in Puerto Rico, I just feel like no one has any sense or can't rely on the government in that way.
Yeah, so I thought maybe today we'd start off actually by talking about some stories that have kind of affected us during this period, because all four of us have had our moments during this lockdown, but generally I would say we've weathered it pretty well, because I think all four of us are kind of like, we have kind of a stable family situation. We're leaders, so we tend to be kind of evaluative or distracted by our work, which helps sometimes, I think. But I think one of the major factors I feel has been being aware of stories around us and people and lives and communities around us that's kind of put our lives in perspective. Not to diminish what we're going through, but just made us think about others in a different way. And so I thought we could, as a jumping off point with each of you, start by sharing with us some stories and encounters you've had that have sort of really rocked your world, made you think, made you focus on being a part of change instead of just kind of holding up and letting COVID kind of run just roughshod over all of us. Yeah, and maybe JC, we might as well just start with you since you're on a roll, right? What's your experience been with the undocumented immigrants that you kind of have a lot of relationships with in where you're at?
Yeah, so I attend a church now virtually that is predominantly Spanish-speaking immigrants from Latin America, and a good portion of our congregants are undocumented. I think, and again, like Pastor Sella was speaking, I can't speak for all of the undocumented community, and I want to be careful that I'm going to share what I've seen, but I'm not undocumented, so I don't experience it or feel it the same way. But some of the members of our church, are the first ones to be affected when you have a lockdown or circuit breaker. If you're a housekeeper, well, immediately when there's talks of how this spreads, people are saying, please don't come clean my house. Whoever is nice pays you, even though you're not going to clean their house, and others just stop paying you immediately because it's a sort of service that there isn't a real contract in place, at least here, that you need to uphold. other members of our community, janitors, that sort of thing, as soon as places start shutting down, are also affected. And then I think nationwide, the undocumented community is just historically doesn't have access to the same help. And even if they did, there's a certain population here in the United States that doesn't think that they're deserving of any help or of any sort of assistance from the government standpoint. I think the contrast there is that that community, one, is known for paying actually into the system taxes and contributing billions of dollars, but then can't reap the benefits of that pay-in later on because of their status. And then the other piece is that by and large, they're feeding us, right? They're the farm workers, the harvesters, the people on the fields are predominantly, immigrants, and many of them undocumented. And so I think that those are the sorts of contrasts, and I know that's what we're going to be talking about, that I think of, the irony of, here are these people that are unprotected, we're not going to help, and yet are sustaining us, feeding us.
Yeah, yeah. And I think you raise an important point that I think is really relevant to Singapore as well, which is the assumption that policies are going to be enough for let's say the undocumented or the migrant worker, because in real essence they may not even be sufficient, whatever the payout is or the help is. And then there's the factor of whether they even dare to access those policies, right? For themselves, because the fear of losing their job or the fear of not being able to win over their employers, I don't know, whatever it is. Yeah, I think that's a really, really big factor that I think with regards to inequality that we haven't really paid attention to sometimes. So Estella, I thought maybe at this point, right, you could share with us, you've been volunteering at SG Accident Help Center. Maybe you can start off by telling us a little bit about the organization and what your experience has been working with them.
Yeah, sure. So my church has a pretty long-term partnership with SG Accident Help Center. And what they do really is, pre-COVID, was that they provided support to migrant workers who had met with accidents in Singapore. So it's actually much more common than you realize, because most of our migrant workers work in the construction industry. So they get like chronic pain as well as on-site accidents, or just like any other people, they meet with other kinds of accidents like traffic accidents or whatever. And so when that happens, they cannot work, and so their work permits expire or they're no longer valid, and then they become injured workers with no jobs and no income, and bosses that don't want to pay for treatment, and so on and so forth. So SG Accident Help Center specializes in helping workers who are injured. This was pre-COVID times. Now during COVID, of course, all the migrant worker organizations are focused on really one thing, which is just to fight COVID in the dormitories and among the migrant workers. Because if you guys have been following the news, the number of cases are just insane. So prior to this, SG Accident Help Center actually worked a lot with purpose-built dorms. So purpose-built dorms are the dorms that were built for the purpose of housing migrant workers. So especially, they have all the living facilities and stuff like that. That's like thousands of workers staying together. So those are like the more established institutions to house the migrant workers. And so SG Accident used to be working there, providing physiotherapy and stuff like that. But now in COVID, because of the huge publicity around these dorms, a lot of other organizations and governments and churches are going into these purpose-built dorms. But what is being less focused on are the factory-converted dormitories, which are exactly what they mean. They are factories that have been converted to dorms, or the workers who don't stay in official housing, so like rental shop houses, apartment blocks, and things like that scattered around. So these workers are receiving much less attention. So smaller organizations that have been on the ground for a long time, like SG Accident, are now turning their resources towards helping these migrant workers who are staying in not purpose-built dormitories.
Yeah. And so one of the things that you brought out, which I thought was very, very astute of an observation, was that there's this impression right now in Singapore, right, that Singaporeans are becoming woke because of the whole crisis with the migrant workers. For those of you who are tuning in, maybe you're not from Singapore. There's about 20 today. I think we hit 27,000 COVID cases in Singapore. But out of the 27,000, a good probably 25,000 right now, or slightly less than that, are actually migrant workers working in construction.
Yep.
As compared to the local population.
Mm-hmm.
So you've been saying that, Singaporeans think we're woke, but then there's all these little things that are slipping through the cracks, right?
Yeah.
So tell us about this idea of, like, you've seen this hierarchy of inequality, and that inequality is actually growing.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is that this inequality among something as simple as accommodation, right? It has existed for a really, really long time. Obviously, the purpose-built dorms, they are not great, but they are okay. There's running water, there's beds, there's like separation between rooms, you can cook. And that's where a lot of the attention is right now. I mean, in fact, if you look at all the publicity and the media that's going out about the efforts, it's always they very specifically say that they're working in the dorms.
Yeah.
There really isn't much being said about people going into factory converted dormitories, or even less going into the rental spaces, because it's just like, it's really scattered. I get it. It's hard to kind of cover all these things. But yeah, so to begin with, pre-COVID, right, factory converted dorms, they are factories. They were not made to be dormitories. So the living conditions there are not great to begin with. People there are not allowed to cook. And like, what do you do if you cannot cook, right? The toilet facilities are not as great as in the purpose-built dorms. In rental shop houses, it can be one small shop house to like house 20 men in a really, really small space. So these were the conditions that existed pre-COVID. And now in COVID, all these things become more serious. They become, I mean, you cannot practice social distancing in a shop house with 20 people. If one person gets sick, all of them will get sick. You cannot practice hygiene because the toilets are limited, so things are getting worse in COVID, and the help that's going out to them, it's not equal as well. Obviously, there's a lot more attention going to purpose-built dorms, and so a lot of funding is going there as well. And that means that gap in the people who live in purpose-built dorms versus everywhere else is just growing in COVID. And so when I was processing with PC, it was like I call it a hierarchy within inequality. So it's like, to be a migrant worker in Singapore there is already inequality. But within that group, there is still a hierarchy. And sure, some Singaporeans are getting woke to the migrant worker crisis and like realizing that this is a thing. And suddenly they're like, oh, okay, we don't live in a perfect city. But there is so much more if we peel back the layers and get to know the people in this generic group that we call migrant workers. Then you see really there is so much more. Yeah.
And let's point out an important point, I think, here at this point, which is, I think it's a myth that COVID created the inequality crisis that we're seeing. Yeah, and I want to make that very clear, because I think all these things kind of existed before, and they're being exposed and now being exacerbated because of COVID. And so really the important thing really is really to have a worldview that thinks about inequality, not just during COVID, but before and after COVID, I think is so important. And really, really thank God, right, for places like SG Accident that are plugging holes. And I really hope that there's more organizations that kind of doing that right now. So Chris, let's get to you right now, all the way in New York. There were two things that really stood out when we talked last, and that is you live in East Harlem, which is predominantly an economically challenged neighborhood. And you've seen some really stark differences between the rich and the poor when it comes to stockpiling. So could you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So the in the early weeks of COVID, before the stores were regulating how many items you could buy per purchase. All the stories coming out, like the media in New York was, the grocery stores are out of supplies. There's nothing, there's all these like doom and gloom pictures of an entire row in a grocery store emptied out, not a single piece of meat, no dairy, etc. And it was a stark contrast to watch that and see that that's the story that is reported. When in fact that story is particular to, if you've heard these brands, Trader Joe's, Whole Foods, Fairway, Food Emporium, these are all places where middle class up can shop. In East Harlem, we don't have those places. We have bodegas, little grocery stores. There's probably like 5 per block that have a select item of stuff. It was interesting. We're walking around in East Harlem. There's not an inventory problem for any item anywhere in any bodega. And so we're seeing all of this New York talk, this chatter of, oh my gosh, we're all out of food. And we're in a economically distressed neighborhood. And we're like, no, we're not. Like literally every place has everything that we need. And the reality sets in that in these moments, folks who are economically privileged get to stockpile whatever the heck they want. And not to mention order off of Amazon and whatnot.
Toilet paper.
Toilet paper. Yeah. I mean, that was the big joke. Like Jill and I got caught up in the scare of like, will we run out of toilet paper? But we're like walking around, every single bodega is like stocked with toilet paper. We're like, well, God forbid these folks come up to East Harlem and figure out that we have toilet paper. It's done. But our neighborhood is people buying what they can and then going home. And there's been these really awesome papers that are getting taped up to any community board or like any light pole, reminding the neighborhood not to shop the 1st through the 3rd, because that's when the money is replenished from the government if someone's living on subsidized income. And that's when the food stamps or WIC can be applied. And so people are saying either stay home. If you can afford to shop any day, then don't go the 1st through the 3rd, because there are folks who really need inventory that day. And particularly don't buy the food that has a certain marker on it that will indicate that this is food specific to a food stamp. And so I feel like the community in East Harlem has actually been quite stable, while a bunch of folks who don't need 30 rolls of toilet paper and, like their 13 turmeric lattes at the same time are like freaking out about how the world is burning. Their world is burning. But people who are living at the poverty line or just above are living akin to the way they've always lived, except now they're also getting blamed for more stuff than they've already been blamed for. So yeah, the economic disparity in certain neighborhoods in New York is very, very, very clear.
Can I just say something really inappropriate at this moment? Not to take away from the severity of that, but
Please.
I was like, thank God, like white people stockpile too, and it's not just Asians. Jeez, but it's kind of like no, white people do it too. Okay, so okay. So the other thing that surprised me when we were talking was that. Now, of course, we know generally, right, that communities in the U.S., especially in New York City, communities of color are disproportionately affected by COVID. I guess just the same way it is here. But when we spoke originally, I assumed that these inequalities were kind of manifesting via geography, where like enclaves of race and ethnicity living, kind of satellite off Manhattan. So in that picture, I kind of assume that what divides the rich and the poor sometimes is the veil of distance. We don't see each other, and so we don't empathize. But what shocked me was when you said how even in densely populated Manhattan, where everyone is kind of crammed up, rich and poor, diverse, next to each other, and yet that doesn't seem to necessarily be creating empathy. So talk to me a little bit about that, and maybe explain to everybody this conversation that we had about this.
Yeah, well, at least as it goes in Manhattan with who's being infected with COVID, who's showing up to the hospitals, and just how Manhattan is built, it is true that folks of different economic strata are sitting on top of each other. It's also true that there's some segregation going on. But Manhattan is so densely populated that you would think if 10 white folk are being infected, then probably 10 black folk and 10 brown folk, et cetera, et cetera. The reality is that brown and black folk make up a large majority of the infections. And it's just been interesting as folks have been writing, reflecting on this in New York, this is just showing what was already true, which is cities like Manhattan can give a facade, can suggest a facade that we're all in this together because there's different economic and different skin color, different ethnic backgrounds, all packed into one place. But the reality is just in our travel patterns, white folk and well-off folk are staying, which are not the same categories, of course, but are staying to their same places, going to their same parks, traveling on. Yeah. And there are, we're in a neighborhood where we are surrounded by housing authorities on every single direction. And the reality is I actually don't have to come in contact with any of those housing authorities besides walking past them. I don't have to shop at the stores that they shop at, et cetera. Like if we chose to not be embodied in this neighborhood. And I would just say that New York at large is, I think, reflecting those patterns. COVID is showing we're not really in this together. We are still frequenting the places that we frequent. And, I woke up this morning and was kind of like preparing on more of what I would talk about. And the article that gets released in the New York Post today is that 9 out of 10 people who have been cited for not socially distancing in parks have been brown and black people. So there's 125 people who last weekend cops were just in the parks, just writing tickets. If you're too close, writing tickets. And 83 of them were black, 30 of them were brown, to make up 125 people. That's not the reflection of the demographics in New York City, but of course that is the reflection of police tactics in America and particularly in New York. So all COVID's doing here is like exacerbating what was already true. And it's making us face some of these realities. Sorry, John.
John, you wanted to say something?
No, I was just going to say there's the picture of, white people at the pier over the weekend in New York, sunbathing, and
everywhere.
The cop is like talking to them. And then you have the picture of pretty much any brown, black community where the police is dragging people off the street for the same reason, because they weren't socially distancing. And again, that's the privilege of being white in this country, is the cop will talk to you and kindly ask you to please, do whatever you need to do. Meanwhile, brown and black people aren't afforded that privilege. They're immediately, policed and into submission, basically.
And New York closing the winter, it comes out of winter. New York like emerges when the cold goes away. And it's so much fun to be in the city. It's a really beautiful moment when there's not COVID around, where you just kind of like see people like a little paler, like a little more decrepit, like coming out into the sun, like remembering that there are nice days. And those have been the last 2 weeks, like beautiful sunny days where you can use the parks. And so 2 weeks ago, everyone came out of hibernation and went to Central Park. Jill and I walk through Central Park every single day with our dog. It's right around the corner. So people are out at Central Park sunbathing. And then nationally, this big story of New Yorkers aren't paying attention to COVID right now because look at these pictures, right? If you look at the picture, Central Park, it's all white people everywhere, sunbathing, hanging out, picnicking. And so when we dug a little bit deeper into where the police are going, they're actually avoiding Central Park, which they know is predominantly a place where white people go. And they're going into places in Brooklyn and Queens, much smaller parks where people just need 5 minutes of green. And police are riding up in horseback and writing those people, arresting those people, writing those people tickets. So it's the thing that put New York on the map were pictures of Central Park. And then the mayor said, okay, we're going to start writing tickets. That started last week. And the mayor didn't even go to Central Park where the pictures are. He went to other places with the police. So yeah, it's affecting. It's disproportionate.
So then let me move the conversation along to this then, which might be slightly dicey in Singapore, but how culpable should the government be or institutions be in mitigating inequalities and racism? And And I mean, what do you think of the idea that is usually thrown around, which is we've got limited resources and therefore that is all we can do for others? Like talk to me about that. How culpable should governments be? And on the flip side, how culpable should we be as a human race? Um, like like how how much depends on us? How much depends on the government? Of course, the answer is both, but kind of talk to me a little bit about that. What needs to change in order for us to see uh, um, more equality?
um, Argument that this article made. And I think like that's the thing, like a lot of these narratives are so subtle and insidious, and that is the most terrifying thing to me, that it's hard to separate, because it's not wrong to say that Singapore is prosperous and we're prosperous because of this, but prosperity is not a measure of a society's success, at least not for Christians. I don't think that like economic wealth and power means that you are a good, faithful Christian. It doesn't mean that. And I think that sometimes it's a narrative a lot of us have been brought up with, that if you are a good Christian, God will bless you. You will have all that you need and God will provide. And that is true, but that's only half of the truth, right? You cannot exploit people in order to get that provision or in order to get that economic prosperity, because that God then punishes you for exploiting the vulnerable. But it's just a narrative that we've grown up, that the measure of a successful Christian life is that you are successful economically, you're successful in your career, in your studies, and that means that you're a faithful Christian. And so therefore, if our economy is prosperous and successful, that means that our country is just, is fair, is doing a good job. But it's not. That is not the way we measure success.
Jesus didn't say the first shall be first.
I don't know what Bible you're reading, but no.
And that to inherit the kingdom, we should lead and tell other people what to do. Jesus didn't say that.
Okay, bye. It was nice knowing you, but I don't think we can be friends anymore.
So you use the word imagination, and I want to dwell on that word for a second, because every single social change has required a good amount of imagination, and I think if Christians aren't bending the world towards, to the just pray about it thing. Let me back up to the just pray about thing. Read James 2, right? Like, you have faith, show me your works. Faith without works is dead. So cool. Don't stop praying. Appeal to God in prayer, petition God in prayer, submit to God in prayer, and also get to work, right? Like, I think that's just clear in James 2 to us. So we need to put in the work. Number two, as it pertains to imagination, it requires radical, disruptive, dangerous, selfless imagination to move from a world that you're born into where there's slaves, and then say, this doesn't feel right to the gospel that I know, and then imagine that into reality with your work until there's a world where there isn't slaves. Like, people, like, an imagination is to think of something that is not yet, right? And so as women in America fought for suffrage, fought for the right to vote, as Black folk fought for inclusion, right now as our brown siblings fight for citizenship, any way that we look at it, right now, of course, we can't imagine a Singapore where everyone, migrant workers included, are paid and compensated at a fair enough rate, and healthcare is at a fair enough rate where everyone has access to the same access that Estella has. That requires imagination. But perhaps that is absolutely central to the Christian heart, which is, I can't stay in the thing that is right now because it's not good enough. I'm not being idealistic. I'm literally born to imagine the world day one into better being with my actions, so that I leave it behind, and then my children or the generation that comes after picks up an imagination and carries it like that. Like, we can't do anything but keep doing the same thing unless we subversively imagine something different.
And by the way, the system quickly shuts down those who start to imagine. And one sector that I might say, and I think really is pertinent to the evolution, is youth and artists, right? In most social changes and movements, artists have been at the front of it because of that, and they're in tune with imagination. But our society doesn't really value artists, like, except for Spotify and whatever else we, as long as they're mainstream. But people who use art, whether it's graphic, songs, etc., to say something that challenges, are pretty quickly shut down. But if you look at the history of movements in the past, is that artists with their graphics, with their songwriting, have really, and because art touches us in a way that the intellect doesn't necessarily. So if you see a picture of something, it challenges you, Banksy and his, graphics and stuff where he puts something up, it makes you think, wait, what is this about? Or a song. And so I guess my encouragement perhaps for your community is don't shut that down. And
Don't settle.
And for all of us is to actually encourage those voices that maybe it feels uncomfortable, maybe it doesn't sound right, but to encourage them to actually help us to see things that we don't necessarily see.
Wow. Okay, well, I don't want to add to that because I think that's a pretty good place to land on for now, because it's already 9:40 p.m. So I think we should wrap up this part of the interview. For those of you who are going to stay, go to the breakout rooms, hang there for 15 minutes. We're going to come back and have a good Q&A. Where we'll kind of be focusing on how we can be a part of change. So if you have questions to ask, please do submit it. We're going to give you a link to a jot form and you can send it there. And this was just a really good conversation, guys. So thank you very much. So if you can, with me behind your screen, give our guests a big round of applause because they are just fantastic, intelligent, kind people, amazing people. Thank you for that. Super, super inspired.